Two of the destroyers were alongside the Princeton when the Birmingham arrived, and it was only with difficulty that the bigger ship managed to elbow them aside and come in. With hoses laid out and ready, I got alongside the Princeton at about 11 a.m. and immediately began fighting the fire. I found it necessary to run a line to the Princeton to keep the two ships together, since the Princeton, with her high sides, made faster leeway than the Birmingham. My plan was to start fighting the fires from the forward end of the Princeton and work aft. After about half an hour, we seemed to make headway, and Captain Inglis called for a party of volunteers. About 40 men boarded the carrier and began work. They continued to work for 2.5 hours. By that time they had all the fires under control except one, which was very close to the carrier's after magazine. The destroyers moved about picking up men. The Morrison picked up a number, the Irwin picked up some more and also took on wounded. By the end of the day, she had about 600 survivors from the Princeton and took them to Leyte. The Morrison had come over with the Birmingham when Admiral Sherman decided the Princeton needed more help. She moved alongside the Princeton on the lee side, a daring gesture compounded by misunderstanding of instructions from Captain Inglis to deliver some artificers and engine room men that Captain Baraka asked for when things seemed to be coming under control. But then the Morrison became fouled in the overhanging sponson of the carrier's starboard gun positions. When Commander W.H. Price, the ship's captain, had to move forward to escape the fire and smoke, he got hoses off his ship and onto the Princeton. Lieutenant Bradley, the assistant first lieutenant of the Princeton, came back aboard from the Morrison along with an enlisted man from the hull department at about 1 p.m. The Morrison was ready to move, but she could not. She was stuck between the No. 2 and No. 3 stacks of the Princeton. In the rolling, her topside was taking a fearful mauling from the carrier stacks and overhang. Something had to give way, and in her case it was the foremast, the stacks, her searchlight platform, her forward director, and the port side of her bridge. While the Morrison was alongside, the Princeton's navigator managed to go back aboard his ship and onto the bridge from the destroyer, and salvage a number of important papers, which he lowered by signal halyard to the men on the destroyer. The weather, which had been spotty, was definitely worsening as the afternoon came on. This increased the damage to the Morrison. She tried to get the Irwin to pull her off, but the lines passed to the Morrison parted. After almost an hour, the Morrison was still stuck fast to the carrier. It was at that time, said Captain Baraka, that we thought there would be no question, but that the fire would be put out in a matter of 20 to 30 minutes. We had received considerable damage by that time, but as far as we knew, there was no damage below decks. It was our thought that we would soon have the fire out, then ventilate the spaces below, put the engineers down there, get up steam and bring the ship home. The ship was not very pretty, but at least we would bring her back. The captain was an optimist, no doubt about it. The chief engineer had just been below wearing rescue breathing apparatus. He found doors hot to the touch and the smoke so thick a flashlight beam would not penetrate it. The third deck below was hot and full of smoke, and when the chief engineer entered the forward engine room, he had to hold a battle lantern a foot from the panel to read the gauges. When he was back on deck, he advised the captain that it might be remotely possible to get the ship under way. At 1:30 p.m., the whole salvage project was endangered again by the coming of more Japanese planes. The Birmingham pulled away from the crippled carrier, Captain Inglis telling Captain Baraka he must move to fight the Japanese and avoid a cluster of ships that made a beautiful target for the enemy. The Birmingham recalled her fire control party and moved away with the destroyers and the Reno. Everyone, with the possible exception of the chief engineer of the Princeton, was optimistic about the chances for the carrier. When the Morrison cleared away the debris and joined the screen, there was something to cheer about. What a beating she had taken! Even a tractor and a jeep from the carrier's flight deck had fallen down on her. The Japanese air raid flopped partly because visibility had now gotten so bad at sea that it was possible to see only about 100 yards in all directions from the Princeton. The wind was rising and hit 20 knots. It was raining, and the seas were running heavily enough that the men who had been fished out of the water could be glad they were not still there. The Princeton looked much better than one might expect. She was not listing and seemed to have about normal draft. Just after 2 p.m., a single Zero fighter swooped in, and the Reno opened up with its powerful batteries of 20 mm and 40 mm guns. The Zero turned and disappeared into the growing cloud cover. The Birmingham now made a report to Admiral Sherman. Fires on the Princeton now confined to after portion centred about bomb magazines. Prospects very good now. The Morrison had lost her foremast, the Irwin had one engine out of commission as a result of debris in the condenser, the Birmingham had superficial damage including 2 5-inch mounts out of commission, and the Reno had a smashed 40 mm mount while alongside. A carrier was not a safe ship for others to move about, obviously with her big overhanging flight deck, but this damage seemed a small price to pay for what had been accomplished in getting the fires under control. Yet things were not all that they seemed. That one Japanese snooper caused more trouble than he could ever have hoped to do. Captain Baraka was not critical of anyone. He quite understood why the Birmingham had not wanted to remain dead in the water alongside the carrier when Japanese planes were overhead. But the fire, which had been almost put out, started to build again as soon as we stopped fighting it. When the ships cast off, he said he had signalled at the end of the alert for one of the destroyers to come alongside. The Morrison came. The chief engineer of the Princeton said men could get below. Gunner Grant and Ensign Genie went down to try and open sprinklers that would play on the forward magazines. They opened the valves, but nothing happened. A conference among the officers on the Princeton indicated that with the fire now so well under control, it might be feasible to take the ship in tow. The air attack had not developed further, and accordingly, as the Birmingham came by on the port side, a semaphore message was sent to her. "Can you take me in tow?" An affirmative answer came, and the Birmingham prepared to tow. But now it was seen on the Princeton that the fires were gaining headway, and that the Morrison simply did not have the hose power to put the fire out. So Captain Baraka asked that the Reno replace the Morrison and fight the fires again. But the Reno would take a beating if she came alongside, and the Reno could not take either, because she had lost her towing reel on October 14th when a Japanese plane crashed into her fantail. It was decided that the Birmingham would come back, fight the fires to extinction, and then take the Princeton in tow. All this took time, and the seas were rising and the wind whistling. Now the Birmingham began approaching the injured carrier at around 2:45 p.m., with her bow at an angle to the windward port to midships of the Princeton. It was a very difficult approach, and the Princeton would drift away so that the Birmingham had to drop off and try again. Consequently, the fires burned, and it was not until 3:15 p.m. that the Birmingham came close enough to the Princeton for a line to be successfully thrown over to the flight deck of the carrier. In the meantime, said Captain Baraka, I had sent our air officer, Commander Bruce L. Harwood, with several other officers and men, a total of about 25, to the hangar to be there to take the lines and hoses from the Birmingham as soon as she could get alongside. I might say that Commander Harwood had been particularly conspicuous all day by his outstanding leadership in directing fire parties and in his constant disregard of personal danger. There had been no serious explosions on the Princeton since 10:20 a.m. that morning, and now it was almost 3:30 p.m. I had always been concerned about a compartment just aft of the hangar on the starboard side of the ship, which was our ready torpedo storage, and in which we had spare torpedo air flasks, and also an overload of bombs that could not be accommodated in the main magazines below decks. I felt concern about this space not only for our own personnel, but also for the ships alongside. Fires had been raging around that space, and in the immediate vicinity practically ever since the bomb hit at 9:38 a.m. in the morning. The place was impossible to access to attempt to jettison any of the explosives. Additionally, we had no firefighting pressure available from practically the time the bomb hit. I had been led to believe that trinitrotoluene operates in strange ways at times, so I hoped and thought it quite possible that the explosions that would come from that space had already occurred or would not occur. There could have been some low-order detonations, which could not be distinguished from other explosions we had suffered. However, at 3:23 p.m., while the Birmingham was still in the process of tying up on our port side, there was the most terrific explosion of the day in this space. The explosion was as surprising as it was terrifying. It can be well compared to a small volcano. A considerable portion of the after-party fragments, some huge, some small, burst outward and upward, showering the deck of the Princeton from stem to stern. Practically all of us remaining aboard the Princeton were injured. Those of us who were not killed included Commander Harwood and his party, who were in the hangar and were all lost. Captain Hoskins, the prospective commanding officer of the Princeton, who had just recently come aboard, so there had not been time to transfer command, was standing with me amidships on the port side, where we were to receive the lines from the bow of the Birmingham. When those of us in that immediate vicinity first hit the deck and then started to run forward to get behind some planes for protection, someone noticed that Captain Hoskins couldn't move. I turned around and saw his right foot was hanging by a shred. I called for Commander Salah, our senior medical officer, who had been with us just before this explosion, but by some means unknown to him, found himself on the forecastle forward. He was injured. I did not realize this, but he proceeded to render first-aid treatment to Captain Hoskins. Captain Hoskins had fortunately fallen near a piece of line, which he used with great presence of mind to apply a tourniquet to his leg. The doctor made his way to him with some sulphur powder and morphine, using a sheath knife to cut off the part of the leg that was dangling. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Salah himself was given treatment for his wounds. Even with this explosion, the Princeton was still not listing or going down. All the damage was above the waterline. The captain wanted a tow and asked the Birmingham for it, but the Birmingham said she had been hurt by the blast and could not tow. The Reno could not tow. The destroyers were too small to tow. So the word went out to Admiral Sherman that the Princeton needed a tow. Captain Baraka knew that it would be some time before a towing vessel could detach itself from the task group, make its way to the Princeton, and get to work. He decided to take everyone off the ship temporarily, at least, then bring them back when the towing vessel arrived. In a short time we were able to get alongside some small boats from the destroyers on either side of our bow forward. We then proceeded to lower Captain Hoskins by means of a stretcher, followed by the wounded, and finally the remaining personnel. Before this was done, several inspections had been made below decks and throughout the accessible parts of the ship to assure ourselves that no living personnel remained. At 4 p.m, I left the Princeton, the last to leave. Captain Baraka went to the Birmingham to receive a shock. Here is the story of Commander Winston Folk, executive officer of the Birmingham at the time of the explosion on the Princeton. I was on the starboard side of the signal bridge, a few feet from the captain. We were both struck by debris and knocked to the deck. As soon as I had sufficiently recovered, I went to the captain to see how he was. He had gotten to his feet and said he had been hit, but felt that he was all right. At that time, he directed me to ascertain the results of the explosion. I set out to do so, completely unprepared for the spectacle that was to greet me. What had happened was that 229 officers and men were killed instantly, and 420 were wounded, 219 of these seriously, and 4 men were missing. The executive himself was suffering from deafness, shock, and shrapnel wounds. When I returned to the bridge to make my report to the captain, I was due for another blow. I found that his initial feeling of being all right had been the result of numbness from shock. Because of his many injuries, particularly the bad break of his left arm, he had been forced to turn command over to the gunnery officer and to put the commander of the Reno in command of the unit. The executive officer wanted to help the captain, but Captain Englas refused, saying, "Never mind me, there are many in worse condition," and gave the command to the executive officer. The way the men turned to help their fellows was remarkable. The Birmingham had only one medical officer aboard, because the senior doctor had been sent to Santa Fe to perform emergency surgery earlier. The dentist and one chief pharmacist's mate were killed in the explosion, and the junior medical officer had 14 hospital corpsmen to help him. They directed the ship's company to give first aid, and the doctor found those with perforated abdominal wounds as quickly as possible and began operating. 2 groups were formed to splint fractures. When such measures had been taken, the third step consisted of putting patients in sick bay and the wardroom. By evening, a medical officer came from the Reno, and the senior medical officer came back aboard. All this while the Birmingham continued to be a ship of war, and much was demanded of her, said Commander Folk. Shortly after I assumed command, I was informed that the Princeton still wanted to be towed. That seemed almost too much, with over 400 of the ship's company dead or badly wounded, and with all the remainder, including some 200 slightly to moderately wounded who were not actually required on watch, working their hearts out with the badly wounded. We were still faced with the prospect of having to continue to rig for towing. Yet when I consulted the acting first lieutenant and the boatswain, the latter painfully wounded himself, their answer was, yes, if we have to tow, we can tow. Captain Baraka of the Princeton went to the Birmingham and only then learned of the casualties and that Captain Englis was hurt. He moved over to the Reno, where Captain R.C. Alexander had taken charge of the force. When I arrived at the Reno, Captain Alexander informed me that my request for a tow had been sent to the task group and force commanders. But just as I got aboard, the word came back for the Princeton to be destroyed and for the remaining ships to rejoin the task group. The decision to destroy the Princeton was prompted by the damage she had already suffered, the damage suffered by the assisting ships, the fact that the fire was still not out with night coming on, and the fact that we were only 125 miles from Manila. The Japanese had already shown that they had more airplanes up their sleeves than the Americans had previously suspected. Besides this, there was a healthy fear of the Japanese carriers. During the activities of the day, while the Princeton had been fighting for her life, the Oawa force, including carriers, had been located in the north. It was suspected that the planes attacking the task group and the plane that had dropped the 250 kilograms bomb on the Princeton were from those carriers. Nobody in the heat of battle knew all the answers, but the suspicions were enough. A burning carrier at night with the fleet was simply a beacon for the Japanese, who had shown their adeptness at night hawking before. The destroyer Irwin was supposed to smash the poor Princeton with torpedoes, but the Irwin had taken such a beating from the Princeton in coming alongside that the torpedo gear was smashed. She fired 6 torpedoes with almost disastrous results to herself. 2 of them came boomeranging back and very nearly blasted the Irwin out of the water. The first torpedo hit the Princeton in the bow, doing minor damage, and the rest missed. So the Reno took over the job. At 5:50 p.m., the Reno launched 2 torpedoes from a range of about 2,800 yards. I think the first one was all that was required, said Captain Baraka. The torpedo seemed to hit in the Princeton's forward large 880,000-gallon gasoline tank, or probably in the after edge of the tank, which is just forward of our forward magazines. There was a terrific explosion. Flames shot high in the air, and the ship was underwater in less than a minute. That was the end of the gallant Princeton, whose captain had tried so hard to save her. And there was first blood for the Japanese air forces to avenge the events of Palawan. Battle of the Sibuyan Sea. Early on the morning of October 24th, the planes of the American task groups, acting on instructions from Admiral Holly, were out scouting for the Japanese fleet. They knew it was divided into several forces. The first contact with the Japanese was made by a plane from the Intrepid just after 8 a.m. In a few minutes, Admiral Bogan had the news, and so did Admiral Holly. Then the Cabot's planes were on the target in the Sibuyan Sea, complementing and extending the information. Over the American Channel came this message from an Intrepid plane. The force consists of 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 13 destroyers. Location is south of the southern tip of Mindoro. Course 050, speed 10, 12 knots. No transports in the group, and in all a total of 25 warships. Immediately messages began to go out from Holly's 3rd Fleet flag plot on the New Jersey. First were messages to Admirals Bogan, Sherman and Davidson to be sure they had the information. Sherman and Davidson were asked specifically to break radio silence to report any information about the enemy. Then Sherman and Davidson were asked to concentrate on Band's task group, which would pull the carriers together. Holly ordered Admirals Mitcher and Sherman to strike the enemy. Band's task group was the first to be ready to strike, and he reported as such. Holly told him to go ahead and wished him good luck. This was not the way that Admiral Raymond Spruance would have handled the airstrike. Spruance, as commander of the fleet, would have entrusted Admiral Mitcher, the leader of Task Force 38, the carrier groups, with the right and responsibility to give the orders for strikes and all other actions. But Spruance was not a carrier admiral, and Holly was. How could Holly forget the days early in the war when he had the scrappiest task force afloat? It was patently impossible. Holly was just not built that way. It was not that Holly would never listen to reason. He was always listening right up to the point where he would wag his finger, which meant the debate was cut off. But in times when action was needed, Holly was ready to take active command of a situation. Naval historians, principally Samuel Eliot Morison, have noted that Holly sent orders directly to the task group commanders, bypassing Admiral Mitcher, who throughout October 24th was little more than a passenger in his own task force. Holly said he did not bypass Mitcher any more than was his way. I always assigned targets to hit, leaving details to group and task force commanders. I would certainly have been derelict in my duty as fleet commander if I did not assign targets for them to strike, and would have been a fifth wheel if I exercised no control or command over the elements of my fleet. I always did this, and in doing it never felt that I was bypassing any junior echelon in the command. I always felt free to assume tactical command if I thought the conditions warranted it. This was, of course, a difference in attitude toward his command, a very great difference from Spruance. This would lead future historians to compare Admiral William Halsey unfavourably with Admiral Raymond Spruance. Admiral Nimitz used to say that when he sent Spruance out with the fleet, he was always sure he would bring it home. When he sent Halsey out, he did not know precisely what was going to happen. By the time of the Philippines operation, Nimitz had decided to use Halsey largely to roam the seas in the manner of an old-time buccaneer, confident that Halsey would find action if it was to be found, and that he would never shy away from an encounter with the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, the forthcoming major landing operations out of the Central Pacific Command would be planned so that Spruance, the careful, thoughtful, intellectual admiral, would have control of the fleet during those operations. After the war, comparisons between the two admirals were made by Navy men. Some speculated that if Halsey had been at the Marianas in June, he would have sent the carriers out to engage the Japanese fleet by day and would have dispatched the fast battleships for a night engagement, possibly finishing off the Japanese fleet right then and there. Conversely, had Spruance been in charge at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, he would have behaved entirely differently. Spruance confirmed this, even as the battle was ongoing and he was waiting and listening at Pearl Harbor. At 8 a.m. on October 24th, Admiral Halsey was not worrying about how future historians would judge him. His next move was to call back Admiral McCain, ordering him to reverse course from that leading to Leyte, and then, on the dawn of October 25th, to launch a search north and northwest. This order indicated that Halsey was sorting out the picture. Admiral Carney recalled the events in the flag plot on the New Jersey. The reinforced searches were launched in the morning, and because we guarded the aircraft search frequencies directly, we picked up their reports as made. By noon on October 24th, we had remarkably fine information on the composition, course, and speed of two enemy groups of surface ships moving eastward. One, the Nishimura force, was obviously heading for Surigao Strait, and the other was heading towards the Sibuyan Sea, coming around Mindoro. At this point, it is noteworthy that the intelligence information from searches was exceptionally good, thorough, and quickly processed. When these two forces were spotted, we believed there must be a missing piece of the puzzle. This was why the order was given to Admiral Mitcher to find that missing piece. No operation of such scale would be undertaken without accounting for the Japanese carrier force. We suspected they would be north and east of the Philippines. Halsey and his staff were aware of the Japanese tactic of shuttling used in the First Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese could launch strikes from a greater distance due to the lighter, less armoured planes, and the American carriers could not reach them as easily. To counter this, American plans included making a high-speed run-in on the Japanese carriers, preferably at night, to prevent them from employing this tactic effectively. That morning, Admiral Mitcher, stationed aboard the Lexington near the Princeton, reported numerous enemy planes in Task Group 38.3, indicating tough opposition. Despite this, Halsey continued to focus on the enemy carrier task force, sending Mitcher the following top-secret urgent message. Commander Task Group 38.2, enemy carrier strength not located. Keep area to the north under observation. The situation intensified as Admiral Nishimura, with battleships Fuso and Yamashiro, the cruiser Mami, and destroyers Michio, Yagumo, Asumo, and Shura, was spotted in the Sulu Sea heading for Surigao Strait at 9 a.m. on October 24th, some 75 miles east of the Kagan Islands. Planes from the carrier Franklin underestimated the force, misidentifying it as two old destroyers and a larger vessel, which was later sunk. The damage to the Fuso battleship and the Shura destroyer was minimal, and the Nishimura float planes were shot down, leaving the Fuso blind. Similarly, Admiral Shima's force was reported near the Kagan Islands. There were issues with garbled classifications and misidentifications, but these did not significantly impact the command decisions made by Admiral Halsey in the hours to come. The Third Fleet's air arm concentrated attacks against Admiral Kurita's major force during the day. The first strike from the carriers Intrepid and Cabot, launched just after 9 a.m., consisted of torpedo bombers climbing to 12,000 feet and flying in a loose formation, with fighters providing cover. At 10:25 a.m., the fleet was sighted in Tablas Strait east of Mindoro Island. The attack formation approached from 12 miles away, with torpedo bombers directed to attack the leading battleships, while fighters strafed units on the starboard side of the formation. Lieutenant Fair's division provided high cover and made a strafing run on a Japanese destroyer before pulling out. Lieutenant Thompson, diving immediately after at 430 knots, strafed a Japanese heavy cruiser thought to be of the Tone class across its starboard quarter to its port bow. He fired from 6,000 feet to 3,000 feet and pulled out at 3,000 feet. Lieutenant Sonor and Ensign Buchanan dove after Lieutenant Thompson and also strafed the enemy destroyer, executing a sharp turn on retirement through the thick anti-aircraft barrage. After making their strafing run, these fighters then headed toward the end of Davis, 20 miles away. Lieutenant Fretwell's division, which had been acting as intermediate cover at 14,000 feet, was directed to make a strafing attack after the bombers went in with the torpedo attack, which was to be delivered last. Ensign Sins took the lead from Lieutenant Fretwell, whose radio was out, and went in immediately after the bombers to make the attack. Approaching from south to north and nosing down through intense anti-aircraft fire, Ensign Sins picked a Congo-class battleship as a target, dove straight at it, and commenced raking it from the stern forward. He fired from 8,000 feet down to 1,500 feet, then recovered over the bow. Lieutenant Fretwell also strafed the Congo, which was on course 030 degrees, pulling out at 2,000 feet while jinking during retirement. Fighting Squadron 29 pilots observed a bomb strike the Congo on its starboard side. A Hellcat, which had just completed a strafing run, was seen to burst into flames and go into the water. The pilot was not seen to escape. Ensign Dunn and Ensign Turner made a strafing attack on a Japanese destroyer, raking it across its port bow to its starboard quarter down to 1,500 feet. While en route to the rendezvous area, they saw Lieutenant Williams of Torpedo Squadron 29 make a water landing about 10 miles south of Marin Duke Island. With Lieutenant Farker, who returned, they orbited over the spot for 20 minutes, observed Lieutenant Williams and his two crewmen waving from their rubber boat, and, being low on fuel, were forced to return to base. The other attacking Fighting Squadron 29 fighters successfully made rendezvous and provided escort for the bombers and torpedo planes on the return to base. The torpedo pilots broke off from the attack formation, went into a slight echelon to the right, and began a glide approach. They took advantage of cloud cover from 10,000 feet, on down as far as practicable. From there they made individual attacks on the ships off their starboard bow, which were still steaming straight ahead at about 23 knots and sending up a withering barrage of anti-aircraft fire. Lieutenant McPherson led the attack aimed at the leading battleship. Lieutenant Anderson came in next, but, due to his position in relation to the battleship, he was unable to line up for a run on it. He selected a cruiser, thought to be a heavy cruiser but otherwise unidentified, ahead of the battleships on the port beam of the formation as his target. His aiming point was the starboard beam, and he led 1% ship lengths ahead of the bow while making this run. Lieutenant Anderson's turret gunner strafed as they passed across the bow of the leading battleship. During the retirement, the gunner saw an explosion mid-ship on the starboard side of the cruiser. Lieutenant Skidmore made his run on the leading battleship from the 3 o'clock position. He was not in a position to observe the results of this drop. During the attack, his gunner saw 2 bombs from his plane hit the second battleship, which was also of the Yamato class. One hit between the superstructure and the stack, and the other hit aft of the stack. The torpedo bomber Lieutenant Skidmore was flying sustained 3 hits by anti-aircraft while over the target area. The gasket on the propeller governor was torn out by a 50 caliber bullet, and a 40 mm shell went completely through the fuselage laterally, just behind the radio man's seat. Daniel Joseph McCarthy, aviation radioman 2nd class, suffered shrapnel wounds in his left thigh and heel. The blast from a 5-inch shell bent up the fairing at the port wing hinge. Lieutenant Ballantyne came in at about the same time as Lieutenant Skidmore. Having gone down around rather than through the cloud, he was in a position to attack the second battleship. He dropped his torpedo from the 2 o'clock position, but did not observe the results. During his approach toward the battleship, his radio man saw an explosion, and quantities of black smoke arise from a cruiser in the forward part of the formation on the port side. Although no positive identification is possible, it is thought that this was caused by Lieutenant Anderson's torpedo. Lieutenant Williams's drop was not witnessed by any of the other men of the attack. Following the attack, his plane was seen on fire 15 miles northeast of the disposition, where he made a water landing. During the torpedo attack, with the exception of the lead battleship, which made a slow turn to starboard, the 135 ships did not turn or resort to any evasive maneuvers. One reason for this may have been that the ships were still slightly off guard, though they certainly were not off guard as far as anti-aircraft was concerned. Anti-aircraft was very intense. The planes retired at 200 to 1,500 feet, jinking as they went until 10 miles out, where they rendezvoused. They then made an uneventful return to base, completing the strike. One man, Lieutenant John Wesley Williams, had been shot down along with Aviation Ordnance Man 2nd Class James Eugene Boland and Aviation Chief Electrician's Mate 1st Class Bronislaw Lawrence Rinsky. When last seen, the 3 were waving vigorously from their rubber boat. The strikes continued in the afternoon, but this time the Japanese had been mauled by several attacks from carrier-based planes and were behaving quite differently. The fleet had divided into 2 groups, manoeuvring with 2 battleships in each group, each surrounded by cruisers and light cruisers and a screen of destroyers. One of the battleships, Musashi, was seen to be smoking heavily. The planes of Torpedo Squadron 29 started on the damaged battleship. However, the battleship changed course and headed away, so they attacked a Tone-class cruiser instead. They could not see the results, but were sure they secured at least 1 hit on the cruiser. The 2 divisions of Fighting Squadron 29 fighters attacking the Japanese fleet consisted of Lieutenant Edward Van Franken, Ensign Francis Collins, Lieutenant Joseph Chandler, Ensign Robert Jander, Lieutenant Max Barnes, Ensign Robert Murray, Ensign Henry W. Bolliger, Ensign Emerald B. Cook. These fighters remained as top cover until the bombers and torpedo planes commenced their attacks, then peeled off to drop their bombs on the battleship in the western group of the Japanese fleet. One battleship was seen smoking and circling in an apparently damaged condition. Lieutenant Van Franken decided to lead his division against the second battleship, identified as one of the Congo class. While the Japanese ships fired intense anti-aircraft and later light and medium anti-aircraft against the oncoming fighters, Lieutenant Van Franken led his division in a dive from 13,000 feet at a 70 degrees angle toward the Congo, approaching it from a 7 o'clock position. Lieutenant Van Franken and his wingman, Ensign Collins, dove each other and released their bombs at 3,000 feet, pulling out at 500 feet. They passed across the starboard bow of the Congo and executed a 180 degrees turn to port to avoid the fire of the units of the Japanese fleet ahead. As they made their turn, they observed that Lieutenant Van Franken's bomb had landed 100 feet from the battleship, just abaft the port beam, and that Ensign Collins had scored a near miss with a drop 20 feet off the port side of the ship, about 20 feet forward of the fantail. Lieutenant Chandler, in a less steep dive behind Lieutenant Van Franken with Ensign Jander on his wing, strafed the Congo from 10,000 feet and continued firing to 4,000 feet. He increased his lead and dropped his bomb at an altitude of about 3,000 feet, making 350 knots. Lieutenant Chandler pulled out at about 2,200 feet and was followed by Ensign Jander, who had also released at 3,000 feet. They retired in a northeast direction, jinking over Japanese cruisers and destroyers firing from below. Lieutenant Van Franken and Ensign Collins observed Lieutenant Chandler's bomb strike about 30 feet off the starboard side of the Congo, about 80 feet forward of the fantail. Ensign Jander's bomb dropped about 500 feet from the port side of the Japanese warship and slightly aft. All 4 pilots of this division made rendezvous successfully about 10 miles northeast of the Japanese fleet and provided cover for the SB-2Cs during the return to base. When in his dive and at 6,000 feet, Ensign Baliga felt his plane jarred by anti-aircraft fire and saw that more than half of his starboard aileron had been shot away. The impact rolled the F-6F around, but it still responded to the controls, and Ensign Baliga continued his dive aimed at the bow of the Congo-class battleship. He released at 4,000 feet with unobserved results, then pulled out at 2,500 feet. Although his plane was hard to turn, he was able to make the rendezvous and return to his ship. Back at the ship, the flight commander made reports to Air Intelligence to confirm and amplify what had been said over the radio during the fighting. The report of the Kabat planes was certainly not exaggerated. On this second strike, the flyers made no claims except for having attacked. Nevertheless, pilots reported many things, and there were many pilots reporting because 259 planes attacked the force of Admiral Kurita that day. Lieutenant L.R. Swanson dived on what is believed to be a Congo-class battleship. Interrogation indicates that he obtained a direct hit almost midships and slightly to the starboard side. This hit is verified by personnel of VT-19 Squadron. Lieutenant J.L. Butts Jr. also dived on the battleship. For an undetermined reason, his bomb failed to release, whereupon he requested permission from the Air Group commander to make a second attack. Permission was granted, and he made a one-plane attack on a heavy cruiser, scoring a hit or a near miss. Lieutenant P.R. Stradley and Lieutenant W.P. Weddell are believed to have dived upon a heavy cruiser. The results of Lieutenant Stradley's bomb drop are not known, but it is believed that Lieutenant Weddell obtained a probable hit upon this ship. Lieutenant C.H. Bowen dived through the overcast, corkscrewed around a cumulus cloud, and dropped upon what he described as either a light cruiser or a destroyer. He dived very low, completely blacked out himself and his crewmen to the extent that his crewmen never did see the ship upon which he dropped. It is not known which ship he dived upon, and the question of which ship he attacked cannot be definitely settled. Aviation Chief Radioman A.F. Drosser, who was riding with Lieutenant Stradley and taking pictures at the time, reported that a destroyer exploded, broke in two, and sank almost immediately. The VT squadron in this group did not attack this ship, and its exploding is unaccounted for unless hit by Lieutenant Bowen or by planes from another air group. We are not attempting to claim the ship, but feel that the important thing is that it was sunk. Carrier Air Group 16 from the Essex made other strikes. Their report was very heartening to their shipmates when they returned. The VT formation torpedo planes was divided into two 8-plane divisions, Lieutenant Sorensen's division leading, and Lieutenant Commander Lambert's division. The former went down to attack before the latter. Since 2 pilots of Lieutenant Sorensen's division are missing, it is not known which targets they chose. Lieutenant C.H. Sense and Lieutenant L.G. Muskin were the first to drop. When they made their attacks, the two battleships were almost in column, with the Musashi in the lead. Lieutenant Muskin was the first in. He dropped from 600 to 700 feet at 250 knots, at a range of 1,300 yards, 30 degrees on the starboard bow. His run was made from southeast to northwest. His target was the rear battleship Congo. He states that he had an ideal shot, but that the anti-aircraft was so intense he was unable to see the result. Both crewmen say that the torpedo ran hot, and Lieutenants C.H. Senson and Leitner claim that he made a hit amidships. Lieutenant Senson attacked the Mushi and obtained a direct hit on the starboard side, confirmed by Lieutenant Bleach, who saw a large explosion on the Mushi. After attacking a cruiser, Lieutenant Commander Lambert and Ensign Hodges were next to attack the battleships they had identified as the Mushi. Lambert did not see how he could miss. The two battleships were virtually bow to stern at this point. He dropped from 650 feet at 240 knots from 1,500 yards out, at 80 degrees on the port bow, and was certain he had scored a hit. Ensign Hodges's crew said he also scored a hit, and they heard two explosions as they pulled away. Lieutenant R.L.B. came in next, followed by Lieutenants S.M. Holliday and H.A. Goodwin. The others said B made a hit on the battleship. Crewmen said all three of them did, although only two explosions were heard. Summing up the attack on the Mushi, it would appear that at least 3 hits were obtained, 1 on the starboard side and 2 on the port side. 3 pilots then attacked the Congo. Lieutenant R.D. Cosgrove dropped from only 450 feet, 2,000 yards out, and claimed a hit. Lieutenant R.D. Chaff claimed a hit on the bow. South of the battleships and slightly ahead was a carrier, probably of the NA class. This cruiser was torpedoed by 2 pilots in Lieutenant Sorensen's division. Lieutenant William S. Burns said he scored a hit, and the cruiser lost speed as he watched her. Lieutenant O. Bleach dropped from 400 feet at 1,200 yards out and thought his torpedo was running true, but he was hit by anti-aircraft fire and could not tell what happened next to the ship. Other pilots said they saw 2 different explosions on 2 different cruisers, and another pilot said he saw at least 1 large explosion on the Mushi. Lieutenants Paul Southard and W.F. Axman failed to join up. Others had seen 1 plane go down in flames and the other make a hard water landing just outside the Japanese destroyer screen. At the time, no one knew what had happened to that pilot. Later, it was learned that Lieutenant Axman and one of his crewmen had been rescued. Other Lexington pilots that day ran into very determined opposition from the Japanese air forces. Among them, one of the most successful teams was the division of fighters led by Lieutenant W.J. Masoner, Jr. Masoner's account details their operations. They took off at 6:10 a.m., escorting 4 SB-2Cs on a 300-mile search from 275 degrees to 285 degrees. They encountered a front spreading from about 50 miles from the ship to about 20 miles inland. After flying instrument for 25 minutes and emerging from the front, the bombers were out of sight. They eventually spotted the bombers circling at 8,000 feet over the eastern shore of Lingayen Gulf, Luzon. As they joined the bombers, they saw a group of Betty bombers and shot down 2. Masoner picked one and attacked, observing its 20 mm gun firing from its turret. His incendiaries hit the fuselage and right wing, causing the bomber to burst into flames and hit the water. The Betty was likened to a cigarette lighter because it burned quickly and then like a Roman candle. Masoner pulled up from this attack and saw 8 Nells about 100 feet above. He turned and spread slightly, attacking the right-hand plane. He put a long burst into its starboard engine, which started to burn, and it fell in a mass of flames. During this time, 4 or 5 flamers and smokers crashed on the shore. When no more planes were available, they rendezvoused and continued their search. About 50 miles out, they spotted 2 Nells, dove down after them, and chased them for 5 to 6 miles. Masoner dropped his bomb, caught up with them, and made a run from above. One Nell's right wing burned and exploded, causing it to dive into the water and burn. Masoner started to make a run on the other Nell, but it was already burning and crashed. His wingman Copeland got him. The Nels had new ball turrets, and one hit Masoner's section leader's engine, but he was able to proceed. They then joined the bombers, flew cross-legs, and started home. As they approached Luzon's shore, they spotted 5 Nels at about 500 feet. Masoner and his wingman went down on them. His wingman burned one, which crashed. Masoner then made a high quartering run on one Nel, observing hits. He did a wing over and came up under its tail to avoid the ball turret, hitting it in the fuselage at very close range. The Nel exploded and nosed straight down into the water with no fire. Masoner then came up from behind and above on the next Nel, hitting it in the wing root. It exploded and burned, crashing afterward. This left 2 Nels out of the 5. Masoner made 2 passes on one, and on the second rode its tail until it burst into flames. It crashed very low. By this time, Lieutenant Wee Davis III, Masoner's man, had come down from escorting the bombers. They chased the last Nel over land, and though both got good hits, it wouldn't burn. Masoner's guns stopped entirely, so they withdrew. There was no question about the kills. Gun cameras from Masoner's plane filmed all 6 Japanese airplanes being shot down. Other stories from Masoner's division echoed this success. Lieutenant W.E. Copeland went after a Betty, which burst into flames and crashed into Lingayen Gulf from 2,000 feet after a stern run and a long burst. He then caught a Nel low over the water, gave it a long burst, and both engines caught fire. He found a Lily at 2,000 feet over Lingayen, rode its tail, and tried to flame the enemy ship, but it would not burn, and the engines died, causing it to crash into a rice paddy. Lieutenant Bennett shot down a Betty and later an unidentified twin-engine plane. He also reported a Nel from 500 feet, which burned and crashed. Bennett was hit by the turret gunner of a Nel and stayed high from then on. Lieutenant Davis got a Betty, singled out one, and fired several bursts into it, causing it to dive and crash. No bets were seen to get away. These were some of the tales the pilots brought home from the strikes against the Japanese that day. They were obviously very impressive. It was significant that the pilots of the Lexington's Carrier Air Group 19 were so successful in their attacks, as the Lexington was in the heart of the fighting fleet, and Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 38, was on the Lexington that day. Messages of success came steadily. At about noon, Admiral Mitcher sent a gleeful message to high-morning search reports. 2 Niori-class cruisers, one dead in the water just offshore northwest, tip Mindoro, the other off west shore Luzon. I damaged a cruiser in Manila Bay. Enemy has been flying several large groups of twin-engine planes from Formosa to Luzon. About 100 enemy planes shot down. Now striking enemy fleet east of Mindoro. No reports yet of results. We have another large blip heading from the northeast, launching search 35 to 040. At 1:05 p.m., the Princeton still afloat, soon High was reporting to Nimitz in Pearl Harbor of the attacks in progress. He reported stopping a destroyer and then hits by the Intrepid planes on a cruiser and a destroyer, bomb hits on 2 battleships, rocket hits on a cruiser and 2 destroyers, and torpedo hits on battleships and cruisers. There were so many reports that it seemed obvious the Japanese were taking a serious beating in the Sibuyan Sea. By evening, it appeared that the Japanese were thoroughly disorganized. Admiral Mitcher reported them milling around aimlessly in several groups, not like a determined enemy force, but rather like one that had been cut up and did not know what to do. Mitcher revised his estimate of Japanese planes destroyed to 150 for the day. Yet another slightly sobering note was observed in the same message. Mitcher thought the loss of the Princeton's fighter force had hurt them considerably, and felt the shortage of fighters at that moment was significant. On October 23rd, after the disastrous submarine attacks on Admiral Kurita's force, Admiral Toyoda's Combined Fleet Headquarters assessed the situation and renewed orders to the fleet. It was very probable that the enemy was aware of the concentration of Japanese forces. The Japanese planned to concentrate submarines in great strength in the San Bernardino and Surigao Straits areas, plan attacks on American surface forces using large planes and task forces after the morning of October 24th. plan decisive action by concentrating surface strength in the area east of San Bernardino Strait and Tacloban, where the transport group was located. The Japanese plans included making up for their inferior surface strength by directing the enemy to the north towards the main body of the mobile force, Ozawa's carriers, and other ships. They emphasized maintaining a stricter alert against submarines and aircraft, utilizing every possible trick to keep enemy submarines under constant pressure. That morning, as Admiral Kurita's fleet approached the Sibuyan Sea, he requested to have fighters protect his fleet, but this was denied by the Japanese Fleet Command. Japanese air cover remained minimal, and by 8 a.m. the Japanese fleet was engaged heavily, with American pilots reporting more hits on battleships and cruisers. Admiral Mitcher reported, "Japanese reports indicate the battleships are virtually out of action. 2 are dead in the water and unable to help. There is no evidence of a coordinated response to American attacks." The Japanese Second Air Fleet, which was supposed to attack American task forces and landing forces, had only 3 planes available. Additionally, Japanese communications were confused, with reports of submarines and small aircraft carriers leading to incorrect conclusions and failed responses to American assaults. By October 24th, Japanese defences were strained, with the fleet scrambling to maintain order amid constant air attacks. Despite attempts at evasive maneuvers and anti-aircraft fire, the American airstrikes were effective, contributing significantly to the disarray and eventual defeat of Japanese forces in the area. Japanese and American times differ in these actions. Both are used to give comparative feelings, even at the expense of historical accuracy. The fleet opened fire, sending up a very strong and impressive barrage of anti-aircraft shells. 4 minutes later, torpedo bombers came in on the Miyoko from the bow, and the captain saw the wake of a torpedo coming and evaded, but one of the torpedoes struck the starboard side. After the engines stopped, the after-starboard generator room, the after-engine room, the inner and outer shaft rooms to starboard, and the electrical system all began to suffer. Soon the rooms were flooded and the electrical system broke down. The ship began to list heavily to starboard, and the crew shifted gear and heavy equipment as rapidly as possible. Port compartments were flooded and fuel oil was shifted as temporary repairs were undertaken. The divisional flag was shifted, and then at 11:38 a.m., the Mayawa was sent on her way back to Brunei out of the battle. She could make 18 knots, but could not be expected to keep up with the fleet or fight with the others. The Americans soon came over again, attacking the 2 Japanese formations with the battleships in the middle, and the ships retorted as best they could, like angry cats spitting up their hail of steel and fire against the planes. According to Admiral Ugaki, there was a visual message from Masashi, a battleship, to the effect that she had received a torpedo hit on her starboard side, but that her speed was unimpeded. Strange as that sounds, it was true at the time. Masashi was a huge fighting machine, heavily armoured, and bombs tended to bounce off her armour plate. Yamato took a torpedo but steamed sturdily along. "If this is the extent of the damage, it isn't too bad," wrote Admiral Ugaki, who was keeping a running diary of the fight. At 1:30 p.m., a third wave of planes appeared. Here is Admiral Ugaki's doleful account of the battle and the loss of one of his favourite ships. Before this, the outer skin of Mihi's port P bow had become peeled, causing a larger wake. Since the maintenance of high speed became increasingly difficult for Masashi, all ships were warned to reduce speed to 22 knots and carry out evasive manoeuvres, but Masashi still continued to fall behind. Then Mushi was again hit by a torpedo, and Yamato sustained 1 bomb hit and 1 near miss on the bow. The other near misses and evaded torpedoes were too numerous to enumerate, and the small number of enemy planes shot down is regrettable. Since Mushi continued to fall behind and there was no hope of her accompanying them, it was decided to have her head for Manila, escorted by the destroyer Cosimo. At 2:26 p.m., a fourth wave of 50 planes, and at 3:20 p.m., a fifth wave of 8,100 planes attacked Nagato. The battleship sustained 2 hits amidships in the fifth attack. Mushi, which was putting up a desperate fight at a considerable distance from the main body, started emitting black smoke and listing to port, becoming unnavigable. Becoming apprehensive about the situation, Masashi requested the dispatch of another destroyer. The second section, using its judgment, dispatched Tone for them. Musashi was taking a terrible beating, and although she was a stout battleship, no ship could long sustain power with 10 torpedoes in her as Mushi had. She had also been hit and suffered near misses by many bombs, and even a near miss is enough to start loosening rivets, seams, and structural members of a ship, weakening her in many ways that may not immediately be apparent to the eye. She had 19 torpedoes in her and perhaps 17 actual bomb hits. The Yamato and the Nagato had been hit, and the battleship Haruna was damaged by a series of near misses. By mid-afternoon, Admiral Kurita's force had suffered seriously. Whatever would happen to the MR, it was obvious she was not going to go much farther into Philippine waters with those American planes after her and her situation so grave. Still, Admiral Kurita's force was very strong. He had 4 battleships still going, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers. Several destroyers had been sent back to escort or help the stricken Musashi and Miyoko. By this time, the Kurita force was located in the Sibuyan Sea, some 20 miles northeast of the north end of Tawi-Tawi Island. The ships of the fleet were disposed in 2 circular formations about 8 miles apart, with the bigger ships in the middle and the destroyers outside. This formation gave the new anti-aircraft guns the power they needed, and made the Americans very aware of effective anti-aircraft fire as they dived in, but it was a difficult formation to maintain and take evasive action, and when ships were hit, the whole picture changed. By noon, the force had broken up and reformed, and the Mushi, with her plating torn loose at the bow, was literally ploughing the sea. As Admiral Ugaki noted in his diary, Admiral Kurita that afternoon notified Combined Fleet Headquarters. The first striking force is engaged in hard fighting in Sibuyan Sea. Enemy air attacks are expected to increase. Request land-based air forces and Mobile Force Ozawa to make prompt attacks on enemy carrier force estimated to be at Leyte Gulf. This was a plea for help, of course, but it was not one that the Japanese could do much about. They had already begun attacking the American carrier force, and absolutely all they got out of it was the lucky hit on the Princeton that eventually destroyed her. That day the Japanese ploughed on without the Mushi, but at their reduced speed of 18 knots because of the damage to the ships from the air attacks. At 3:30 p.m., Admiral Kay's staff estimated that they would be attacked 3 more times that afternoon before sundown. They also roused several submarine scares, and the destroyer Aisho carried out a depth charge attack on a submarine that did not exist. Combined Fleet was preoccupied with the submarine menace, and while the ships of the Japanese fleet were licking their wounds and repairing damages between air attacks, a message came warning them specifically of submarines that might get them before they approached San Bernardino Strait. "Be alert," said the message. "Be alert." How could Kurita be anything else with this rain of steel pouring down out of the sky, and the buzz of diving planes that scarcely stopped echoing in his ears between airstrikes? Recklessness alone kept the fleet on its course, said Masanori Ito in his study of the Imperial Japanese Navy. That recklessness, of course, was planned for. Admiral Kurita expected to lose half his ships in this operation. However, he had really expected to lose them in San Bernardino Strait, and now he was becoming aware of the fact that the whole Japanese staff in Tokyo had completely underestimated the American forces they would encounter. When he left Brunei, the best intelligence he could muster gave the Americans some 200 transports, 7 battleships, and an appropriate number of cruisers and destroyers in Leyte Gulf. He never received another piece of intelligence. He asked for planes to be sent from San Jose and Mindoro to scout the American force, but he never received the word except that bad weather had kept the Japanese scout planes from carrying out the mission. By 3:30 p.m., Admiral Kurita was considering the future course of action and decided to turn back, to withdraw outside the effective range of American aircraft, and wait for the Japanese air forces in the Philippines to get organized enough, which he really expected they might do, to deliver counterattacks to the Americans. He did not realize that the Japanese land-based air and Ozawa's force were doing all they could, and it was like trying to bite an elephant. Here is the message Kurita sent to Combined Fleet. As a result of 5 aerial attacks from 6:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m., our damages are not light. The frequency and numerical strength of these enemy attacks is increasing. If we continue our present course, our losses will increase incalculably with little hope of success for our mission. Therefore, we have decided to withdraw outside the range of enemy air attack for the time being and return to sortie in coordination with successful attacks on the enemy by our Air Force. Now, Kurita felt that the plan was already wrecked by the American attacks. The submarine and air attacks together had put him 6 hours behind time. The plan had called for him to make 22 knots all the way, which would put him into Leyte Gulf at 6 a.m. on October 25th, while Nishimura coming from the south would get in about 5 a.m., but now, with a 6-hour delay, he could no longer even come within an hour of Nishimura. He figured the 22-knot speed far below the capability of the fleet had been established because of the fuel curve. If they went faster, the tankers they had could not supply them with enough fuel to get home. Everything had begun very badly and continued badly. One reason Kurita decided to turn back was that he had received at about 10 a.m. a dispatch from Nishimura stating that things were going sour down south too. The dispatch was not specific. The Fuso was hit, but not too seriously, but when accompanied by what Kurita and his staff had seen happening to themselves, they figured that Nishimura was resorting to a little Japanese understatement. Yet inexplicably, while turning about himself, Admiral Kurita did nothing to change Nishimura's drive up from the south. Admiral Toyoda was anything but pleased by the message of Kurita's turnabout. When it was sent at 4 p.m., he did not approve, and there was a suggestion that Kurita was doing less than he should. But aboard the Yamato, it was quite a different story. Admiral Ugaki, the diarist, was not party to the decision, but did not disagree with it. It is true, if we are attacked by planes as often as this, it will appear that we have expended ourselves before getting to the battle area. But our situation being what it is, we can't retire even if we chose to. There is a doctrine that in each and every instance, the fastest means of settlement should be elected. My opinion at the time of sailing was that the only means available to us was to sortie determined to die. However, I am aware that to reverse course once until evening in order to deceive the enemy will be advantageous for tomorrow. Ugaki, who was there, knew that Admiral Kurita had no intention of retiring, but was trying to take the heat off his force, hoping for one of those miracles that the Ozawa force would decoy the American planes away from him, as it was supposed to do, or that the Americans would get the idea that he was retiring. A plane from the Intrepid noted the turnabout almost as soon as it occurred and notified his task group, which in turn notified Holly. By 4:20 p.m. the message had been received. Admiral Bogan was cautious in his assessment of the change in course. He sent this message by talk between ship's circuit. Flash report, 3rd Strike Enemy Force reported at 4 p.m. at 12°42 north, 122°39 east, course 270, speed 17. This force has been 14 miles to the east of this position, but reversed course during time attack was over. Target, 2 battleships reported to be of Congo class were damaged and circling, apparently not controlled at 12°39. North, 122°48 east. The first was listing under fire, the second less damaged. Course to west, maybe retiring or maybe protection for cripples. Other reports came in from the other carrier groups, and they told of hitting battleships, cruisers and destroyers. The build-up was very strong aboard the New Jersey. By 8 p.m. many things had happened in the Philippines, and they were more or less summed up in the message that Holly and his staff put together and sent out to Admiral Nimitz, General MacArthur, Admiral Kincaid, and the task group commanders of the Third Fleet. Here was what they thought they knew. On the 24th, launched strong dawn search teams from 3 groups across Luzon and Visayas. At 7:45 a.m., search planes contacted enemy force. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 13 destroyers. Kurita, 15 miles south of Mindoro. 38.2, Bogan launched strike immediately and repeated during the day. 38.3, 3 and 38.4. Sherman and Davidson struck same force. After initial strikes on their targets, 38.3 reported 1 cruiser, 1 light cruiser, 1 destroyer in Manila Bay, all damaged. Estimates of damage by blue subs. This was the Ioba force, which was to take troops to the back of Leyte after first strike 38.3 under heavy air attack. Around 150 planes were shot down in a series of raids, culminating in an attack on the Princeton. This was a significant Japanese air effort. The Princeton was heavily damaged, and Birmingham suffered personnel casualties from the explosion on Princeton while alongside her. The enemy force, southeast of Negros, consisted of 2 Fuso-class battleships, 1 cruiser and 4 destroyers. The engagement resulted in 2 bomb hits on each battleship, rocket hits on the cruiser, 2 destroyers strafed, and 2 remaining destroyers, which were not seen to sink. This was Nishimura's force. The main body reversed course to 270 degrees around 2 p.m., 30 miles east of Tas Island, and was again attacked. Incomplete reports indicate 1 Yamato-class battleship was bombed and torpedoed, left afire and down at the bow. 1 Congo-class battleship received 2 bomb hits and was badly damaged. Bomb hits on 1 or both remaining battleships, 2 torpedo hits on 1 of the bombed battleships, 1 light cruiser was torpedoed and capsized, and 2 cruisers received torpedo hits, with another cruiser bombed. At 3:40 p.m., just after learning that the Japanese fleet in the Sibuyan Sea had turned around, Sherman sighted an enemy force near 18°10 and 125°30 E. The report evaluated it as 2 Issei-class cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers, on course 210 degrees, speed 15 knots. At 4:40 p.m., another group was sighted near 18°25, N 125°28, E Zuikaku, 1 light aircraft carrier, 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers, on course 270 degrees, speed 15 knots. This was Ozawa's force, found by Holly's planes just when Admiral Kurita hoped they would. Kurita was heading towards San Bernardino Strait. By 5:15 p.m., American planes had seen him heading away. Kurita had reversed course again, switching back as if frightened and running, which aligned with Admiral Holly's plans. Admiral Toyota in Japan sent a message at 6:15 p.m. with confidence in heavenly guidance, stating, "The entire force will attack," which was as close to a furious remark as a fleet commander would receive from headquarters. The battle was still on. Admiral Ugaki saw the Musashi again, and noted that all of MHI's officers and men remained at their posts without complaint. He thought Musashi might hold out until the following morning. Tone, a damaged cruiser, requested to rejoin its unit and was ordered to do so at 6:30 p.m., with some damage control personnel remaining aboard. The Japanese fleet, including Kurita, steamed towards San Bernardino Strait and Leyte Gulf, expecting the unexpected and ready to fight to the death. Kurita did not even know that the Americans had finally found Admiral Ozawa. At 7:37 p.m., Mushi listed sharply to port. Captain Inoguchi, following Admiral Ugaki's advice, ran for the nearest shore but could not change course without risking the ship. At 6:50 p.m., the bows were completely submerged, and Mushi sank quickly, taking nearly half her crew of 2,400 down with her. Admiral Ugaki expressed his deep sorrow and the sense of losing a part of himself. Ugaki resolved that if Yamato faced the same fate as Musashi, it would be a significant loss, but he would still have Nagato. He was determined to share the ship's fate, reflecting the Bushido spirit of courage and resignation. At 7:51 p.m., the fleet changed from a circular formation to a compound column and continued westward, indicating they were back on the attack and moving quickly. The fleet headquarters had received a radio from Combined Fleet ordering the force to proceed ahead, trusting in divine guidance. They underwent 5 or 6 air attacks with limited reconnaissance information. The fleet was to conduct search attacks in the area where they could approach and contact the enemy. Admiral Ugaki was concerned about the enemy concentrating air attacks from a distance, leading to potential decisive battle and annihilation with anti-aircraft action alone. Admiral Ozawa, intending to be found by the Americans, faced challenges. His supply train faced trouble and did not reach its destination smoothly. The first supply force arrived at its fueling rendezvous, but the second supply force encountered a submarine attack, resulting in the sinking of one escort and diversion of another. Ozawa's force, which was low on fuel, struggled with communication issues. His plans to draw the Americans and attack were complicated by these issues. Despite trying to deceive the enemy with dummy messages, his efforts were hampered by technical difficulties. On October 24th, Ozawa aimed to draw the Americans toward him, but his plans were affected by inadequate communication and fuel shortages. If his force could not achieve its objectives, he planned to attack again on October 25th with any remaining planes. Just after midnight on October 24th, Ozawa began getting information. He learned that his first supply force arrived at the fueling rendezvous. One of his cruisers detected a submarine, and the destroyer Suzuki attacked without results. At about the same time, word came from the night searchers off the Philippine coast that an American task force was sighted. At 5:30 a.m., Admiral Ozawa's carriers launched their search planes. By 8:30 a.m., they had either found the Americans or the task force had been detected by land-based air, and the Ozawa fleet was aware of it. Ozawa, dissatisfied with the base Air Force findings, ordered one of his own search planes to make contact with the American group and to particularly observe the weather. Admiral Ozawa, the fighting admiral, knew that he really had only one strike to make and wanted it to be as effective as possible. Unfortunately, the weather in the vicinity of the American ships was generally foul. Back in the days of Pearl Harbor, this might not have been a significant issue, but with his pilots, whose average age was 20 and who had insufficient flying time, it was risky to engage a large American force, especially given the superior American fighters, pilots, and the bad weather. Just after 10 a.m., the Hyuga detected a large air formation on her radar, bearing 90 degrees due east of the Ozawa force, about 170 miles away. It could have been a Japanese force returning from an attack, but it was more likely a strike from one of the carriers moving toward Luzon. Soon the contact was lost, but the alert was on. Ozawa ordered 3 planes to be put up immediately for a combat air patrol. A 3-plane patrol was inadequate compared to the dozen the Americans deployed, but it reflected Ozawa's ongoing problems. It was costly in aviation fuel, diminishing his already slim fighting force, and he was unsure if the pilots would return safely. By 11:15 a.m., Ozawa had more information. Search plane number N reported an enemy force of more than 10 combat ships, though the weather made it impossible to determine if carriers were involved. However, a plane from Mung Naval Air Base confirmed at least 2 carriers earlier, as did the blips on the Hyuga's screen. By 11:30 a.m., Admiral Ozawa and his staff decided to launch an all-out air attack against the American task forces identified by search plane number N. Due to the foul weather and knowing his pilots were inferior, it was deemed unwise to ask them to fight and return to the carrier. Instead, the pilots were to attack and then proceed to Nichols Field in Manila or another suitable location. Ozawa promised recovery in the waters east of Luzon, though he did not believe in the actual recovery of those planes or pilots. He doubted if the Ozawa force would ever see Japan again, but, as an imperial naval officer, he found defeat unthinkable and could only project the appearance of victory through orders. After launching, the force would proceed westward, not to recover planes, but to lure the American fleet north and prevent their planes from striking Admiral Kurita's fast battleships. By 11:45 a.m., the planes were launched, 40 fighters, 28 carrier bombers, 2 reconnaissance planes, and 6 carrier attack planes, totaling 76 planes. Admiral Ozawa settled down to wait for results, but heard nothing. Given the current state of Japanese communications, delays were excusable, but total silence was concerning. The only update was that the American task forces were now bearing 210 degrees, about 150 miles away, indicating a change in course. Ozawa soon received one bit of information. 3 planes returned to the carriers, reporting they had been unable to find the enemy. This was discouraging, and the silence about the fate of the other planes added to the frustration. By 2:30 p.m., feeling quite low, Ozawa began modifying his tactical plan. He knew the attack must have failed, or he would have received some information. He decided it was imperative to continue the diversion of the enemy to the north in support of Kurita's force, even if it meant losses. He dispatched the Advanced Guard Carrier Division, 4 destroyer divisions, 61 and 41, to further this plan. 2 more planes were launched to maintain contact with the enemy until dark. Ozawa planned to steam west until 4 p.m. to ensure the enemy knew he was there and then move east. He believed the Americans had known his position for hours. Later, he claimed to have personally seen an American plane that sighted his force on the morning of October 24th. However, the American plane never reported the sighting to the 7th or 3rd Fleets, as no one knew where Ozawa was until evening. Ozawa's frustrations continued. By 5:25 p.m., no reports had been received from the planes. They might have been shot down or forced to land in the Philippines. The sinking of the Princeton had American combat air patrols buzzing around the carriers like angry bees. The weather was bad enough to discourage even the most experienced pilots. The effectiveness of Ozawa's airstrike remained a mystery. The first planes, a flight of 30 fighters, 19 fighter bombers, 4 torpedo planes and 5 attack planes, were launched from the carriers Zuikaku, Chiyoda and Chosai. A second group from Zuikaku was launched a few minutes later. According to Japanese historian Masanori Ito, this force did attack the Americans, but the results were negligible, some near misses, damage to landing ship tanks and other ships, but no capital ship sinkings except for the Princeton, which had been damaged early in the day by a shore-based plane. The Japanese air forces were not working effectively on October 24th, either from land or sea. Intelligence reports were fragmentary and inaccurate, reflecting the bad weather and inadequate pilot training. They noted that the 2nd Air Fleet on the morning of October 24th consisted of about 200 planes, but by the night it claimed only 102 planes left. Considering Ozawa's 70-odd planes and the Army's planes, the claims seemed understated rather than overstated. The Japanese lost many planes to the weather, and Admiral Fukui concluded that Admiral Onishi's kamikaze plan was the only viable option. On the night of October 24th, Japanese air commanders discussed establishing a unified naval air command in the Philippines to use kamikaze tactics. Just after 4 p.m., Ozawa had one minor satisfaction, a negative one. Ozawa's force sighted one American Curtiss plane, and from listening to the transmission, learned that the report of Ozawa's existence was out. Grateful for this, Ozawa sent up 2 fighters, but the American plane escaped through the clouds back to its carrier. Around 6 p.m., the cruiser T reported more than 20 planes, presumably enemy, on a bearing of 300 degrees. Ozawa was unsure if this was a late afternoon strike from Clark Field or an American strike force returning. He did not want to be hit by carrier planes at that moment. Knowing the Americans would likely follow him north to wipe him out, he headed north to escape the planes and lure the American carriers away from their attention to San Bernardino Strait. His plan was to carry out operations as scheduled, sending off all remaining air strength to renew air action and draw off forces attacking 2nd Fleet Kurita. Despite the impressive naval order, Ozawa's remaining planes were few, only about 20 to face the American fleet. If nothing else, Ozawa was an example of pure courage. It was not long before Ozawa received confusing information, causing him to change his plan. Around 8 p.m., a delayed report indicated that Kurita had turned around and was retiring. Kurita knew no planes had helped him and was unaware of Ozawa's actions. Kurita's message expressed a sense of despair and wild hope, indicating that the resumption of advance should depend on friendly air forces' results. Though Kurita was already moving back into action by the time Ozawa received the message, the situation was dire. Considering Kurita's action and the danger of the mobile force becoming isolated, Ozawa ordered the entire force to reverse course temporarily to the north. Rear Admiral Chiaki Matsuda and the Hyuga were recalled from what was essentially a suicide mission, and the Ozawa force headed north. By 9 p.m., Ozawa had ample time for second thoughts and realized he still had his own responsibility. He was somewhat reassured by the combined fleet's direct order for Kurita to return to action. Admiral Ozawa made a new estimate of the situation. The enemy's actions today show that they are fully aware of the operational objective of the first striking force, Kurita, and have therefore concentrated their attacks on this force. Given the threat posed by the first striking force's operations, it is very probable that the enemy on the 25th will again focus on that force. Consequently, the Mobile Force Main Body, in accordance with Mobile Force Main Body Operation Order No. 1, will risk its own existence and carry out diversionary operations at all costs. In cooperation with the first striking force's penetration, the main body will advance to the southeast in preparation for operations tomorrow morning. Ozawa then issued a fleet disposition order. Of the 4 ships, only the Kiri was detached. This destroyer was running low on fuel and was sent to Amami Oshima to refuel and then rejoin the fleet. Meanwhile, the supply force was experiencing troubles. At the same time, the Akazi and her small contingent were detecting transmissions they suspected came from enemy submarines. The transmissions began just after dark and continued long into the night. The Akazi was on alert and began making sonar contacts with what seemed to be submarines. She went out on search patterns along with escort number 31. They tried evasion patterns, but the sonar pings continued, those ominous noises that sent shivers down the back of a tanker man and caused frustration for destroyer crews who could not get within range. At 4:45 a.m. on October 25th, as the little force was heading for Amami Oshima and had reached 30 degrees 15 north, 129 degrees 45 east, the pings grew louder and more insistent. 3 torpedoes struck the side of the Janai Maru, causing it to blaze with precious fuel oil before sinking to the bottom. In the blinding light of the Janai Maru's fire, the men of the Akazi were on high alert, searching through the darkness. They and escort number 31 charged across the sea toward the point where the torpedoes had originated, but found nothing. They began efforts to find and trap the crew of the American submarine. Meanwhile, Admiral Matsuda was still moving south against the Americans, believing that the Americans had suffered damage to 2 carriers, and that only 1 carrier and 2 battleships remained in fighting condition. He assumed his force could cope with them. Matsuda, though following orders, had no personal hopes of emerging alive from this battle. At about 8 p.m., Matsuda and his men observed some flashes of light in the distance, which they could not identify. He thought they might be gunfire from land fighting, or possibly sheet lightning, or an electrical storm. He paralleled the course and continued searching for American forces, determined to engage in a night battle if possible. However, the flashes never materialized into anything identifiable. Before midnight, Matsuda had to either obey Ozawa's orders or disobey them. He chose to obey and reluctantly turned north to rejoin his chief, meeting the Ozawa force just before sunrise on October 25th and joining up in the prescribed formation. The Japanese conduct of the Showa operation was confused and hampered by failures in communication facilities. The American conduct of the response to the Showa operation was similarly affected by human errors in communication and assumptions based on the excellence of the American communications network. Both sides suffered from a lack of coordination. Usually each side has a single commander, but in this battle, the Japanese had at least 4 commanders in the field. Admiral Kurita, in charge of the pincers movement with Admiral Nishimura supposedly under his command, Admiral Shima, who was practically independent, Admiral Ozawa, who struggled to coordinate with Kurita, and Admiral Fukudome, in charge of the Second Air Fleet. Loosely coordinating these efforts was Admiral Toyota in Japan, who ensured Kurita moved forward through San Bernardino Strait and that Ozawa knew Kurita had resumed the attack. This was better coordination than among the Americans at the communication level. Admiral Nimitz was in charge of the strategy of the Third Fleet, and General MacArthur was in charge of the invasion of the Philippines. Neither did anything on October 24th that affected the tactical manoeuvre. If the 7th and 3rd Fleets had exchanged high-ranking officers at the fleet staff level, and had these officers been familiar with their respective admirals' thinking, the battle's conduct might have been different. What happened in the next few hours in the Philippines was very much a matter of character and communications, as well as national character and individual bravery. In the afternoon, when it was known that the Japanese were moving up through the Sulu Sea and that Nishimura and Shima would come through Surigao Strait to strike at the American ships in Leyte Gulf, Admiral Kinkaid began piecing together the Japanese plan. He sent a message to all his forces, with copies to Nimitz, all the commanders of the Third Fleet's task groups, Admiral King in Washington, and General MacArthur, warning of a night engagement. The message estimated the enemy force to include 2 battleships, 4 cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 10 destroyers. It reported that the enemy was under attack by carrier planes in the eastern Sulu Sea at 12:10 a.m. on October 24th, which was about 9 a.m. local time. The enemy might arrive in Leyte Gulf that night, so all preparations for a night engagement were to be made. Task Group 77.3 was assigned to Commander Task Group 77.2 as reinforcement. Barkey's battleships were assigned to Oldendorf, Commander Task Group 70.1. PT boats were stationed in maximum numbers in the Surigao Strait, remaining south of 10 degrees north during darkness. Admiral Kinkaid was alert to the dangers and confident in his battleships, cruisers, and escort carriers' ability to counter the Nishimura and Shima threat. Admiral Holly arranged for the independence of Admiral Band's task group to deploy night fighters and search planes to monitor the enemy. In mid-afternoon, Admiral High directed a message to his fleet commander with copies to Admiral King in Washington and Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. The battle plan established Battleship Division 7, Miami Vincennes Beloit, Destroyer Squadron 52, less Stephen Potter from Task Group 38.2, and Washington, Alabama and New Orleans, Destroyer Division 100, to form Task Force 34 under Admiral Lee, Commander Battle Line. Task Force 34 was to engage decisively at long ranges, while Task Groups 38.3 and 38.1 were to operate as planned. If Admiral Matsuda had continued south and engaged at night, Lee would have taken on Matsuda's 2 battleships and other ships. If Admiral Kurita had not turned around and headed back toward Brunei, Admiral Lee would have been stationed off San Bernardino Strait, ready to fire on the Japanese vessels as they came through. Meanwhile, Admiral Kinkaid, an unknown party to the message, drew conclusions. Holly was doing what was needed, establishing the battle line and Lee's command for future engagements. The plan appeared perfect because High indicated he would keep 2 new battleships, Massachusetts and South Dakota, with the task force and leave others with the Lee force. However, Admiral Kinkaid overlooked the fact that the New Jersey, Holly's flagship, was part of Battleship Division 7 assigned to Lee. To assume Holly would assign himself out of the pursuit of Japanese fleet carriers was to misjudge his character. In the afternoon, as information about the forces in the south came in, Kinkaid and his staff counted the enemy's battleships and deduced that if another force was coming from the north, it would have 2 battleships. The Isa and the Hyuga were the only battleships left that could be out hunting trouble. Admiral High and his staff pondered the reports, believing the Japanese had suffered significant damage and were retreating. When Kurita turned around, it was reported by carrier planes, and Admiral Davidson responded to orders, noting he would need to break off from Nishimura to comply. Holly and his staff reviewed the situation, recognizing that throughout October 24th, the strength of 3 carrier groups was concentrated on the center force, while the southern group was considered less critical. A reasonably good analysis of target coordinators' reports and photographs was available to the commander of the Third Fleet. Admiral Carney H's Chief of Staff had a slightly different assessment from that of his chief, which was made on a different basis. He and the other staff members agreed that the centre force kept coming forward but had received so much superficial damage that they were not in a position to render the best account of themselves. Nor could they be strong enough to gain a decision, even if they pressed through the San Bernardino Strait toward the objective. Later, Admiral Mitcher's flag plot aboard the Lexington had a slightly different perspective, as would be expected for the commander of the carrier forces. The day had started with relatively little information and a general feeling of uneasiness. Of the 4 task groups, one, McCain's, was on its way to Uith ATL to replenish planes and supplies. The other 3 forces, especially after the attack on the Princeton, which immobilized her almost immediately, felt that they were barely in a position to do the job. Commodore Ali Burke, Mitcher's chief of staff, remarked, "We were fighting again on a shoestring." He referred to the long period of effort and the attrition suffered since early October when the Third Fleet set out against the Japanese. They had succeeded in defending the Philippines, but the cost in airplanes, men, and sleep had been heavy. The problem of assembling intelligence reports was quite different from reading the story of these actions in a book where results are known to historians. It's much easier to see who did what, when, and what could have been done differently had the enemy's actions been precisely known. Commodore Ali Burke provided insight into how things looked from the flag plot of the Lexington. They started the day with reports of Kay's fleet in the Siunan Sea and soon began taking heavy air attacks. Sherman's Task Group 38.3, in which Mitcher's flagship was stationed, bore the brunt of the Japanese air attacks throughout the day. In the morning and around noon, attacks came from the west, but by mid-afternoon they were coming from the northeast. Mitcher and Burke concluded these planes were likely coming from a carrier force off the Philippine coast. In past weeks, Mitcher and Burke had concluded that the Japanese were short on planes due to the many different types they had encountered around Formosa. However, they did not have Japanese production records or Admiral Onishi's reports on the scarcity of planes in the Philippines. What they had were their eyes, the sight of the Princeton burning and the sounds of battle as the American combat air patrols and strike forces fought against the Japanese planes. They were well-coordinated attacks, said Ali Burke. In retrospect, the air battle of Task Group 38.3 that day might sound like an easy victory, but it did not seem so at the time. For example, with the Princeton burning, Admiral Holly had asked Sherman to close up on the task group in the mouth of San Bernardino Strait for another reason. The Princeton had launched a strike, and if it moved too far away, her planes might not return. There were many moments of uneasiness that day that did not show in the routine reports. Meanwhile, enemy air attacks were being repelled, and a search to the north and northeast with single planes in each subsector was conducted. With only a few planes in the task group, they launched an attack into the Siunan Sea, feeling that there were enemy planes to the northeast and southwest. They sent a few planes northeast in hopes of picking up something. At around 3:40 p.m., those search planes contacted an enemy force reported as 3 battleships, half a dozen cruisers, and 6 destroyers, and another contact of 3 carriers, 3 cruisers, and 3 destroyers on a course west at 15 knots. The first group was the Matsuda force, headed south for a night engagement. The second was the Ozawa force. However, the Americans did not know about Shima's smaller force, and the Japanese vessels still at home, including several large carriers. American intelligence was unaware of the carriers' status, their readiness for sea, or their planes' availability. Much guesswork was involved on both sides. Initially, they thought these reports were of the same group, but later realized they were 2 separate groups, a carrier group and a surface group. Admiral Mitcher and his staff began planning their response. They were too far from the enemy to make an air attack that afternoon, and planned a night attack with surface forces attached to 38.3 on the enemy carrier task force. Had Mitcher proceeded with this plan, it would have involved sending Admiral Lee with the Massachusetts, South Dakota, Alabama, Washington, and possibly the cruisers Mobile and Reno to attack, along with necessary destroyers. Most fast battleships would have gone north due to the general tactical situation, potentially upsetting Third Fleet's plans. As sunset approached, Third Fleet's plans were crystallizing. On the New Jersey, Admiral Holly's officers were consolidating everything learned during the day. It was evident that the Japanese Navy was making a major effort, whether for direct attack or troop transport was unclear. If this was an all-out attack by the Japanese fleet, one piece of the puzzle was missing: the carriers. Earlier intelligence had suggested they might be in the Empire, with sightings and reports indicating possible replenishment measures. Holly did not know the status of the carriers, except that previous experience had shown Japanese carriers to be extremely dangerous. Despite the lack of carrier reports from American submarines in Empire waters, it was believed that carriers would be involved in any major operation. Holly concluded that the Northern force was disposed in two groups, estimated to contain at least 17 ships and possibly up to 24. The Japanese operation appeared deliberate and coordinated, with a focus on geographical location and timing. Holly's staff, affectionately called "my brilliant staff," had put together impressive figures on the damage done to Kurita's force. Reports claimed Battleship Yamato, damaged by 3 torpedo hits. Battleship Yamato, damaged by 1 torpedo hit and 2 bombs. Battleship Nagato, damaged by 1 torpedo and 1 bomb. Battleship Kongo, damaged by 2 torpedoes and 6 bombs. Cruiser Mami, possibly sunk by torpedo. Cruiser Nai, damaged by 1 torpedo. Cruiser Tone, damaged by 1 torpedo. Admiral Sherman's claims included 1 battleship badly damaged, 2 battleships damaged, 4 cruisers damaged, 2 light cruisers damaged. Admiral Davidson's claims included 1 battleship Musashi damaged by torpedo, probably sunk, 1 battleship Yamak damaged by 3 torpedoes and 2 bombs, 1 battleship Kongo damaged by 1 bomb, 1 cruiser damaged, 1 light cruiser sunk, 1 destroyer sunk, 1 destroyer probably sunk, 4 destroyers damaged. Details said Hall's men were not available at dusk, but flash reports indicated that the center force had been badly mauled, with all its battleships and most of its cruisers significantly reduced in fighting power and life. By evening, Holly knew that Kurita's force had turned around and was heading back to San Bernardino Strait. He had to make a fundamental decision. Alternative 1, divide the forces, leaving Admiral Lee and Task Force 34 to block San Bernardino Strait, while the carriers, with 2 battleships and cruisers and destroyers, attacked the northern force of Ozawa. However, the potential strength of the undamaged northern force was too great to leave unmolested, risking spread-out strength and unprofitable damage. Alternative 2. Maintain the integrity of the striking force of the Third Fleet and keep the fleet off San Bernardino Strait, allowing the northern force to function as planned. This approach would permit the destruction of Japan's carrier force, a key to future operations. Holly did not like the idea of spreading forces and risking unprofitable damage. He was aware of the Japanese air resurgence on October 24th and their pipeline technique for ferrying planes. Despite not knowing the exact number of planes available or the strength of Ozawa's carriers, he leaned towards concentrating the fleet's strength against the northern force. In the end, Holly decided to strike the northern force with all of his fleet's strength, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded. This plan appealed to the fighting admiral in him, maintaining the integrity of his striking fleet and offering a chance to hit the Japanese hard and destroy the enemy carrier force. He estimated that even if Kurita gained a temporary advantage, the Third Fleet could return in time to reverse any situation. The staff agreed with Holly's decision, which was rooted in the experience of dealing with the Japanese and their tendency to follow predetermined plans without flexibility.